I'm going to talk about the cooperative ownership as stewardship pattern, and I will read the heart, the little description, and then riff on it. It's a really interesting thing to think about. So the pattern says, extractive absentee ownership tends to undermine whole system well-being. Ownership is a resource by those who cooperatively create, sustain, and use it, especially when that ownership doesn't restrict access. Tends to engender whole system well-being. So support broad ownership by stakeholder stewards willing and able to care for resources on behalf of all involved. Okay, so part of what I find intriguing about this pattern is it sort of blends at least two different ideas together, one of which is ownership and one of which is stewardship. And the idea that the people involved, there's a whole cooperative movement. I live in a cooperative house. I have shopped at cooperative grocery stores, co-ops. And the idea is that the people who own it are the people who live in it, or the people who work there, or the people who shop there, or whatever. The people who are involved own it in a legal sense. And there is not profit that is separate from the people who are involved. Some co-ops, they send if they make a profit, they send a check to people at the end of the year saying this is how much we made, your share of what we made, etc. So all sorts of different cooperative structures, but the idea is we own it. And underlying that is an assumption, sometimes explicit, sometimes not, that goes with all ownership, is if you own something, on one hand, you get to do with it what you want. On the other hand, there's a sense of responsibility for caring for it, stewardship. And one of the interesting challenges, this whole frame of reference, I got recently reading about Native American consciousness, ways of experiencing life. And the idea of ownership is by and large alien to them, except in a very personal sense. You can own your moccasins, you can own your, bow, whatever. But in terms of owning land, owning anything that's natural, this is weird. So you don't own the tribe doesn't own itself. I mean, what are you talking about? This is a web of relationships. So there's, even as I'm pushing ownership, I'm also understanding that there is an alienating dimension to ownership. Instead of being in relationship and interacting and being responsible because you're in relationship, you're being responsible because you own it. The relationship is one of ownership. I realize the difference between having an employee and a slave. You own the slave, and we all know that that's not something that's in any way desirable. And if you totally control a person that you employ, that comes close to slavery. I mean, there's a whole spectrum there. People who collectively own the business they work for, that's a whole different relationship. They are in relationship with each other, they're in relationship with the purpose of the organization, etc. So the idea of cooperative ownership is we are in relationship with each other here in whatever the enterprise is. We are in relationship with with our customers, our suppliers, whatever, and there's a sense of relationship is what this ownership is all about. Now this blends over into care for the earth, which is part of why the earth is pictured with this pattern description. The sense that what we're doing is the spirit of it blends over into our relationship with the human and natural world. Most co-ops like the co-op I live in is sort of an eco co-op. It tries to varying extents, depending on who moves in, who moves out, whatever. Uh, Garden, buy organic food, whatever, and have, try and have low energy use in our house, etc. So the co-op movement tends to be more ecologically and socially responsible than other forms of ownership and business. And so I'm trying to implant both of those in here as companions, the idea of stewardship for whatever our enterprise is, stewardship of each other, stewardship of the larger world we're in. We're trying to use the fact that our society requires ownership, we're trying to use that fact to relate to further the health and well-being of each other, our enterprise, our community, our world. So that's the spirit of this. And when you have extractive absentee ownership, somebody who owns a business in order to control it, to take value out of it rather than let the value remain in it, the more financially focused it is, the more that's true. You're drawing value out for your personal or institutional use rather than feeding the value, letting the value circulate within the enterprise, within the community, within the ecosystem, whatever. And you don't have a relationship so much except what you can take out, which is closer to a slavery kind of ownership relationship. So I don't know what words would better describe that, but that's what I'm trying to support and say. And if we're going for accessing, evoking the wisdom and resourcefulness of the whole on behalf of the whole, like the Prime Directive tells us to do, this is a fundamental basic principle that supports that.